We live in a time where people feel an almost compulsive need to respond to everything, to defend themselves at the slightest misunderstanding, to comment, correct, argue, and explain constantly. There's this cultural obsession with being seen, being heard, being understood immediately and entirely. And yet, ironically, what most people lack isn't the ability to speak. It's the ability to not speak, to hold back, to observe without reacting, to recognize that the real power in many situations doesn't come from what you say, it comes from what you choose not to say. There's a kind of control that silence grants you. It's not passive, it's not avoidance. It's a form of deliberate restraint, a conscious decision to rise above emotional immediacy. When someone offends you, your ego wants to retaliate. When someone doubts you, your pride wants to prove. When someone misunderstands you, your insecurity screams to be clarified. But the mature mind, the evolved individual, knows that every response has a cost. Every reaction you give away is an energy investment. The question is, are you investing it wisely? This is where most people fail. They assume silence is surrender, that if you don't respond, you've lost. But the truth is that silence is often a position of psychological superiority. Think of it like this: if someone throws a hook in a fight and you don't react, they become off balance, they expect resistance, they're banking on engagement, and when it doesn't come, their entire strategy falls apart. It's the same in conversation, in arguments, in relationships. Silence disrupts dysfunctional patterns. It interrupts the power game. It forces people to sit with their own words, their own motives, their own discomfort. The Stoics knew this. Marcus Aurelius wrote about it, how you cannot control other people, only your own reaction. Silence in this context is the assertion of inner control. It says, you don't get to dictate the terms of my emotional state, I do. It takes incredible strength to hold your tongue when everything in you wants to speak. But that's exactly where growth lies, in that space between stimulus and response. That's where self-mastery is built. Let me be clear. Silence isn't always the answer. It's not a tool for cowardice or passive aggression. It's not about emotionally withdrawing to punish someone or pretending to be unaffected. No, that's just a different kind of manipulation. The silence I'm talking about is rooted in clarity, in purpose, in the decision to not let every slight, every insult, every ego challenge pull you out of alignment with who you are. It's the discipline to remain composed when your mind is screaming to engage. And that kind of silence is powerful because it reveals something that you are not controlled by external chaos. You are governed by internal order. This also applies to relationships. The person who always needs the last word, the one who over-explains, over-defends, over-shares, they are not operating from strength. They're operating from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being abandoned, fear of being seen as weak. But ironically, the need to constantly assert yourself is weakness. It shows you haven't yet made peace with the possibility that not everyone will understand you, and that's okay. You can still be whole, you can still be firm, you can still walk away in silence and let your absence echo louder than any argument ever could. Even in personal growth, silence is a necessary companion. Think about it. When are the moments you've had your clearest realizations? Was it in the middle of a heated exchange? Or was it when everything got quiet, when you stepped back, took a breath, and stopped defending yourself for 5 minutes? It's in silence that the truth becomes visible. That's why it's so threatening. That's why some people can't sit still, because when the noise fades, they're forced to hear themselves. And yet silence doesn't mean you're disconnected. Quite the opposite. It means you're connected deeply to your values, to your intent, to your strength. You're no longer a slave to impulse. You're not living reactively anymore. You're choosing, you're directing, and that changes everything. So here's the practical challenge. Next time someone tries to provoke you, try doing nothing. not out of fear, not out of spite, but as an act of power, as a form of self-respect. Let silence do what words often fail to. Let it draw the line, let it speak the boundary, let it carry the weight of your presence without having to raise your voice. Because the truth is, anyone can talk, anyone can argue, anyone can react, but it takes real courage and real control to stay silent when the world expects noise. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes power is the quiet refusal to be pulled into someone else's storm. There's a strange kind of wisdom in choosing not to speak, a counterintuitive strength in withholding your words when the moment begs for retaliation. And maybe the most powerful truth of all is this: you don't always need to argue to win. Silence, properly used, doesn't just avoid conflict, it exposes reality. It removes the mask, leaves the performance without an audience, and in doing so, it forces the truth to step forward, stripped of its theatrics. Most people think that if they don't respond, they'll be misunderstood, or worse, they'll be defeated. They equate silence with weakness. But often, it's the loudest people who are the most uncertain, the ones who can't stop explaining themselves, justifying every word, defending every move. They aren't strong, they're trapped. They're caught in a cycle of needing to be seen as right, because the alternative, being misunderstood or misjudged, is too unbearable for their ego. But here's the reality: you can spend your entire life trying to convince others of your worth, your truth, your side of the story, and still be doubted, still be disrespected, still be dismissed. At some point, you have to decide whether you're going to live in reaction to other people's misperceptions or live in alignment with your own integrity. Silence is the territory of that alignment. It's what you retreat into when you no longer feel the need to participate in emotional theater. And it works because silence creates a vacuum. When you remove yourself from the dialogue, you remove the fuel. No more counter-arguments, no more justification, no more performance. And what happens in that vacuum is remarkable. People are forced to sit with what they've said, what they've done, and what they've become without your interference. Silence is uncomfortable for the guilty. It's haunting for the manipulative. It's unsettling for those who rely on chaos to control you. And yet it is completely peaceful for the person rooted in self-respect. You're not avoiding the truth. You're allowing it to speak for itself. That's the philosophical brilliance of silence. It doesn't defend, it reveals. Think about the most toxic arguments you've had. Did anything actually change from yelling louder? Did going back and forth for hours clarify anything, or did it just deepen the division? The truth is, most arguments aren't about truth at all. They're about dominance. They're power plays disguised as dialogue. And silence, it steps out of the game entirely. It refuses to compete in a contest that was never about understanding, only control. When you go silent, you take away your opponent's leverage. You force them to wrestle with their own motivations without distraction, and this applies far beyond conflict. Silence also reveals people's intentions over time. If you stop explaining yourself, you'll find out who was listening to you in the first place. If you stop chasing after clarity, you'll discover whether the other person ever intended to be clear. If you stop pouring out your energy trying to be understood, you'll see who makes the effort to understand you without being spoon-fed. Silence gives people the space to reveal themselves, and they always do. The psychological principle here is simple but profound. People reveal more in your silence than they do in your presence. When you stop participating in their narrative, you strip away the illusion. You're no longer a character in their drama, you become a mirror. And for many, that's unbearable. That's why manipulators escalate when you go quiet. That's why narcissists provoke when you detach, because your silence shatters the illusion that they are in control. But let's be honest, silence isn't easy. It's not comfortable. There's a war that happens internally when you choose to stay silent. A part of you wants to scream, to clarify, to fight for your truth. But that's exactly why silence is so powerful. It's earned. It requires emotional maturity, a developed sense of self, and a willingness to tolerate temporary discomfort for long-term clarity. In fact, silence teaches you a lot about yourself. If you can't sit in it, if you constantly need to explain yourself, if you fear being misjudged without defense, that's a signal. It's not just about the other person, it's about your own need for external validation. Silence challenges that. It forces you to develop inner stability, to be misrepresented and not crumble, to be lied about and still stand tall, to let go of the need to fix others and focus instead on being unshakably true to yourself. This is what changes you. This is what makes silence not a retreat, but a declaration, a message that says, I see the game, I know the truth, and I no longer need your permission to honor it. So the next time you're pulled into an argument that leads nowhere, or tempted to correct someone who refuses to understand, or provoked by someone who feeds off your reaction, pause. Let the silence speak. Let the truth breathe. Let the truth breathe. Let their own words turn back on them without resistance. Because when you stop talking, you stop feeding the illusion, and what remains is what was always there, the raw, unfiltered reality. Silence isn't just a tool you use in conflict, it's a space you build inside yourself. And that space, that inner stillness, is absolutely essential if you ever hope to change. Not the kind of superficial change people post about or promise in the heat of emotion, but real internal transformation, the kind that alters the structure of how you see yourself, how you act, and how you orient your life. That kind of change doesn't happen in noise. It doesn't happen in constant distraction, in endless conversation, or in the chaos of reacting to everything and everyone. It happens in silence. You see, when you strip away the external input, when the opinions, judgments, validation, and stimulation fall silent, you're left with something most people spend their whole lives avoiding: yourself. Not the version you curate for others, but the raw, unfiltered version of who you are when no one's watching and there's nowhere to hide. And that encounter, that confrontation, is the beginning of change. Because you cannot fix what you refuse to see. And you cannot see clearly in noise. The modern world is engineered to keep you from being silent. Social media, news, entertainment, even our conversations, they're all designed to pull your attention outward, to keep you reactive, stimulated, busy, but silence reclaims that attention. It pulls it back inward. It asks questions that are far more difficult than the ones posed by the world. Questions like, why do I keep repeating the same patterns? Why do I tolerate disrespect? What am I pretending not to know about my own choices? These aren't comfortable questions. They cut through the surface and force you to deal with your own contradictions. But growth doesn't begin with comfort, it begins with confrontation. And confrontation requires space, it requires time. It requires stillness, not a passive stillness, but an alert, focused kind of quiet that sharpens you instead of numbing you. Psychologically, this is about integration. You have parts of yourself, wounded parts, anxious parts, impulsive parts that you've suppressed or ignored. When you're constantly in motion, those parts stay buried. But in silence, they rise. And if you face them with honesty instead of distraction, you start to reintegrate. You start to understand the why behind your actions instead of just managing the what. You start to make decisions rooted in awareness instead of habit. But there's another layer to this. Silence doesn't just connect you to your flaws, it reconnects you to your potential. In silence, you rediscover your voice. Not the reactive voice, but the voice of vision. The voice that asks, what do I actually want to build with my life? What kind of man or woman am I becoming? And what do I need to let go of in order to become that person? Those are the kinds of insights that only surface when everything else is still. And they can be jarring because they force responsibility onto you. They reveal the gap between who you are and who you claim to be. but that gap is your work, and silence gives you the clarity to see it, not in guilt, not in shame, but in truth. And truth is what sets transformation in motion. This is where people get it wrong. They chase change by doing more, new habits, new routines, new commitments. But if those actions aren't rooted in clarity, they collapse because they were built on reaction, not reflection. They were built in noise. And anything built in noise is unstable. You need silence not to escape the world, but to return to it more focused, more grounded, more authentic. Without that internal foundation, you'll be swayed by every external force that shows up louder than your own conviction. Even spiritually, silence has always played a central role in the evolution of the human being. In every great tradition, philosophical or religious, you find the same pattern. The wise withdraw before they emerge. The warrior trains in solitude before the battle. The leader sits with his thoughts before he leads others. Silence isn't emptiness, it's preparation. It's where depth is built. And in a shallow world, depth is a revolutionary act. Now, this doesn't mean you go live in isolation or reject society. It means you create regular spaces of stillness in your life, not just to relax, but to examine, to realign. 10 minutes of silence in the morning, an hour without input, a walk without headphones, a night where you write instead of scroll. These small acts are not small at all. They're declarations. They're ways of saying, I'm willing to hear what my life is trying to tell me. Because the truth is, most of the answers you're chasing out there, through arguments, validation, distractions, they've been waiting in here in the quiet. You just haven't sat with them long enough to hear, so if you want to grow, if you want to change, if you want to build a life that's deeply rooted and sharply focused, learn to sit in silence. Because what the world can't give you, silence often will lull